Good evening. The motion before us is this: the Dutch disease, the economic theory that resource wealth crowds out manufacturing by appreciating the exchange rate and drawing labor from productive sectors, explains why virtually every petrostate has failed to diversify. Norway is the single exception, and it is an exception produced by extraordinary institutional quality, not by defeating the economic mechanism. The oil curse is not a theory. It is a pattern with almost no exceptions. At the table tonight, the empiricist, who asks what we can actually know versus what we merely assume we know, and who will not permit irregularity to be called a law until we have tested what would falsify it. The geographer, who insists that every abstraction eventually meets a place, a particular arrangement of earth and people, and that the map is not the territory. The essayist, who watches what millions of people actually do when incentives change, and who finds in repeated human behavior the patterns that theory often misses. What is at stake is not merely whether oil corrupts economies. That much we can observe. What is at stake is whether the mechanism is escapable, whether institutions can defeat economic gravity, or whether Norway is simply the exception that makes the rule more iron than we would like to admit. If the pattern holds almost without exception, we are not describing a policy failure. We are describing a trap. Empiricist, the floor is yours.
The motion assumes we are observing a mechanism when we may be observing selection bias wearing a causal story. Here is what makes me suspicious. We have 47 countries whose exports are more than 50% hydrocarbons. 39 of them have failed to build competitive manufacturing sectors. That looks overwhelming until you ask what those 39 countries were doing in 1950 before the oil. Venezuela in 1920 was exporting coffee and cocoa. Saudi Arabia in 1930 was exporting dates and pilgrims. Libya in 1950 was exporting scrap metal from Second World War debris. What manufacturing base precisely did the oil crowd out? The counterfactual is not these economies would have industrialized. The counterfactual is these economies would have remained agricultural exporters of declining commodities. Compare Chile. Copper is 60% of exports. The exchange rate mechanism is identical. Commodity boom, currency appreciation, import competition. Yet Chile has electronics exports, a wine industry selling to 30 countries, and a services sector that looks like Portugal's. The thesis would predict Chile should be Venezuela. It is not. Or consider Malaysia. In 1980, oil and palm oil together were 71% of exports. By 2020, manufactured goods were 69%. The resource share fell not because the oil ran out, but because manufacturing grew faster. The mechanism supposedly prevents exactly this. What we are calling Dutch disease may be something simpler. States that never developed administrative capacity, contract enforcement, or property rights do not develop them after finding oil. The oil does not destroy institutions. It reveals their absence by making it possible to fund a government without building a tax system, which is the forcing function that creates state capacity in the first place. The falsifiable claim would be this: if the mechanism is real and institutions are merely lagging, then we should see petrostates with improving governance outperform resource-poor states at similar governance levels. Consider the comparison between Ecuador and Peru, both Andean economies, broadly comparable institutions through the 1990s. Ecuador's oil revenues rose sharply from 2004 as prices climbed. Peru had negligible hydrocarbons, but significant copper and silver. If Dutch disease is the dominant mechanism, Ecuador's manufacturing sector should have been systematically strangled relative to Peru's. The data do not show it. Peru's non-extractive export diversification has outpaced Ecuador's, but the governance divergence between them explains this gap more cleanly than any exchange rate story. That does not mean oil wealth is harmless. It means the harm may not operate through the exchange rate channel we have named.
The empiricist is right, of course. To speak of oil destroying a manufacturing base that never existed is to invent a memory. Most of these states had no such thing to lose. The pathology is not in what was, but in what can no longer be built. Because the Dutch disease is not merely a ghost in the currency markets. It pours concrete, it lays railway lines, or more to the point, it lets them rust. The true mechanism of the curse is spatial. It reconfigures the physical reality of a country, orienting every road, every port, every skilled worker towards a single extractive point on the map, and letting the rest of the territory wither. Look at Nigeria. Before the oil boom of the 1970s, it was the world's largest exporter of groundnuts. The Great Pyramids of sack nuts in Kano were a wonder of agricultural logistics. That required a vast rail and road network connecting the north to the port at Lagos. After 1973, all significant transport investment went into the Niger Delta. The state built pipelines and tanker terminals. The railway that carried the groundnuts was left to decay. This is a pattern familiar to any urban planner who has studied port cities. A resource boom is like a city that builds every arterial road towards a single stadium. The infrastructure becomes extraordinarily competent at moving one type of traffic in one direction, and in doing so, it starves every other route of investment, maintenance, and purpose. The stadium eventually closes, and the city discovers it cannot get anywhere else. Think of a man, let's call him Aliyu, whose grandfather stacked those sacks of groundnuts in Kano. Today, Aliyu farms tomatoes. The rail line that could take his produce to the 10 million people in Lagos, 400 miles away, is a ruin. The roads are so poor that a third of his harvest spoils before it reaches a major market. The only truly modern logistics network in his country is a web of pipelines and terminals 1,000 kilometers to his south, a system entirely useless to him. Aliyu is not trapped by bad exchange rates alone. He is trapped by a national geography that has been physically replumbed for an industry in which he has no part. The empiricist speaks of institutions, of state capacity. This is correct, but incomplete. He is looking at the state's software. I am suggesting the hardware itself has been misshapen, perhaps irrevocably.
The empiricist and the geographer both treat the economy as an apparatus whose failure can be located either in missing rules or in misdirected concrete. They differ on the location of the defect. They share the premise that the decisive choices are made by states. What millions of individual savers and workers have done instead is to withdraw their own labor and capital from tradable activity once resource income becomes dependable. In the Gulf states between 1975 and 1995, the share of private non-oil investment that originated with citizen families fell by more than half even as total capital formation rose. The increment went into real estate, import agencies, and construction tied to government projects. The same shift appears in the allocation of working lives. Young men who would once have entered workshops or farms now queue for administrative posts whose pay is insulated from market prices. Education statistics record the movement. Enrollment in engineering and technical fields stagnated or declined relative to law, business administration, and Islamic studies in precisely those years when oil receipts per capita were highest. This is not an institutional story first. It is a change in the revealed return to different kinds of effort visible in the choices of individual entrepreneurs and fathers deciding where to place an apprentice or a loan. When the state can pay wages without taxing production, the rational allocation of the next generation's human capital moves away from activities that must compete on price. Capital follows the same logic. Bank credit and family remittances that once financed small textile mills or food processing plants now finance apartment blocks and trading houses whose revenues depend on continued public spending. The result is visible in the composition of the non-oil economy itself. Services and construction expand while the number of firms that export manufactures without state subsidy remains flat. The pattern is older than the current vocabulary of Dutch disease. In the Spanish silver economy of the 16th century, Castilian textile production declined not only because the crown spent the metal, but because urban entrepreneurs redirected journeymen and investment capital toward court offices and colonial trade concessions. The workshops emptied because the alternative use of time and money had become more lucrative for the same merchants and guildmasters who had previously sustained them. Where that firm-level reallocation is blocked by tax systems that still require broad production or by social norms that tie status to making rather than distributing, resource wealth has not produced the same sectoral shrinkage. The mechanism therefore operates first through the arithmetic of private decisions, not through the quality of public ones. You claim that petrostates with improving governance outperform resource-poor states at similar governance levels. In economies where governance metrics rose after resource discovery, yet private capital continued flowing toward non-tradable assets at rates exceeding those in comparable non-resource peers, what specific behavioral threshold would falsify the claim that institutions alone determine the outcome?
I cannot name a behavioral threshold that would falsify the institutional claim, which means I have stated it too broadly. The sharper version: institutions determine whether household capital allocation responds symmetrically to resource income. In Indonesia, after the 1999 reforms, decentralization, credible contract enforcement in manufacturing zones, private investment into export manufactures grew even as oil revenues per capita were rising. The Timor Sea fields came online in 2004. By 2008, textile and electronics investment from domestic sources had increased 43%. That is the opposite of what happened in Gabon, where windfall revenues after 1973 were routed through state enterprises that absorbed technically trained workers into supervisory sinecures, hollowing out the private manufacturing base not through exchange rate pressure alone, but through the systematic repricing of skilled labor toward patronage. The difference is not in the resource income, but in whether non-resource returns were legally protected. But here is the question you should ask yourself. If private capital allocation is responding rationally to comparative returns, why does it take 20 years after oil income stabilizes before the reallocation you describe becomes visible? Kuwait's private sector was still funding pharmaceutical plants in 1982. The exodus you describe begins later. What changed? The Geographer claims that the spatial mechanism, the physical replumbing toward extraction points, operates with sufficient force to trap economies, perhaps irrevocably. But temporal sequence matters for causation. If the geographic reconfiguration is the mechanism, we should see infrastructure decay and sectoral collapse follow resource discovery rapidly, within a decade, say, as transport investment pivots. Yet the Ecuadorian Cacao Road network in the Oriente provinces continued to receive maintenance appropriations for well over 15 years after the 1972 oil boom redirected capital toward the Amazon pipeline corridor, before those feeder roads were finally left to deteriorate. What determines the lag? More precisely, in resource economies where rural transport infrastructure was maintained for 2 decades or more after discovery, what observable difference in either state behavior or household investment patterns explains why some geographies resisted replumbing while others succumbed quickly? If spatial lock-in takes 30 years in one case and 5 in another, the hardware explanation needs a mechanism for the variation.
You have caught me in an overstatement. The physical endowment alone cannot explain the lag. A kilometer of track corrodes at the same rate in Wari and in Lobito. The difference in the rate of decay is political. It is the measure of the distance between the geography of the old economy and the geography of the new elite. Consider the Benguela Railway in Angola. In 1974, a signals engineer in Huambo is part of a functioning continental artery. It moves copper from Katanga and food from the highlands. A year later, the Portuguese are gone. Oil revenues are flowing directly to the capital, and civil war provides the rationale. For the new elite in Luanda, that engineer and his entire 1,000-kilometer line have ceased to exist politically. The railway is not just neglected. It serves a geography they no longer need to govern. Its collapse is not a 30-year slide. It is an event. This, then, is the mechanism for the variation. Where old infrastructure serves a population remote from the new petro-elite, it is abandoned swiftly. Your question about Kuwaiti private investment in 1982 is answered by the same map. Think of it as a tide table rather than a weather forecast. The state's fiscal gravity sets the tidal range, and private capital simply moves with the water. Factories rise where the state's purchasing power pools, not where the date farms of the interior once anchored a different economy. The private investor's map is drawn by the state's gravity. The essayist claims the change is in the family's arithmetic, its calculation of status and security. I accept this, but does that arithmetic produce the same answer everywhere? Let us go to Nigeria in 1975. Consider two families. One is in Kano, a city whose textile merchants had supplied trans-Saharan trade routes for centuries, whose commercial reputation was itself a form of inherited capital. The other is in Port Harcourt, in the oil-producing Delta South. Does the son of the Kano cloth trader, whose family's ledger connects to brokers in Lyon and Manchester, abandon the counting house for a federal ministry at the same rate as the son from Port Harcourt, whose neighborhood is threaded through with pipeline contracts and civil service postings? If the pathology is cultural, it should be national, is it?
The distinction you draw is exact. Reputation capital that travels through export markets decays more slowly than status derived from proximity to state spending. The Tabrizi weaver's son retains an option the Avazi does not. His family's standing in European carpet auctions cannot be transferred to a ministry post. Yet consider what happened among the small-batch pistachios growers of Rafsanjan once petrodollar-funded irrigation subsidies shifted the calculus. Orchard owners began withdrawing their sons from the grading and export cooperatives that had painstakingly built relationships with Hamburg commodity traders over 2 generations. The return to sitting inside a provincial procurement office, however modest the salary, was perceived as more predictable than the foreign exchange exposure of export agriculture. The mechanism remains private calculation, only now indexed to the reach of a family's existing networks rather than to a uniform national culture.
The question beneath the question is this: can you see the trap from inside it, or does the trap work precisely because those who benefit from describing it are themselves the product of the arrangement they claim to diagnose? We are in 2026. The United States exports liquefied natural gas, runs a trade deficit in manufactures, and has seen private capital flow into asset appreciation and services, while the production of tradable goods that do not require subsidy moves elsewhere. The professional class whose children study economics rather than enter factories describes this as the consequence of Chinese mercantilism or bad trade agreements. Are we inside a resource curse built not on oil extraction, but on the dollar's role as reserve currency, which functions as a rent on the global financial system? And are we the kind of people who can see it, or does our position in the economy that rents rather than makes prevent us from naming what we are inside?
Resource income changes the price families assign to different futures, and that recalculation outlasts both pipelines and statutes, where the geographer notes that distance from new extraction points can slow the shift. The pattern still appears once the rent reaches the household ledger. In Kazakhstan, after the 1998 Tengiz expansion, rural families within 200 kilometers of the field reduced new investment in cross-border livestock trade by roughly 1/4 within 8 years, while families farther east sustained those networks longer. Property registries record the capital moving into Almaty apartments rather than herd expansion or small slaughterhouses. The same household logic travels when the rent arrives through financial channels instead of wells. American families in states where finance and professional services now account for more than 1/3 of private income have shown steadily lower rates of children entering skilled trades since the late 1990s, even as overall educational attainment rose. Census and labor data track the movement toward occupations whose returns depend on asset values rather than production costs. The outsized returns flowing from Wall Street's intermediary role supply the income stream. Families respond with the same arithmetic visible in any petrostate. 17th century Antwerp offers the long version of this story. Once the city's trading and financial houses reliably outpaid its cloth and metalwork guilds, the apprenticeship registers thinned within a generation, and the productive base that had initially attracted the merchants quietly unmanned itself. The geographer is right that metabolic systems retain memory, and I would add that the memory is stored not in institutions, but in families. Consider the Ruhr Valley in the 2 decades after German coal production began its long contraction in the 1960s. The structural decline was visible in aggregate statistics before it was visible in any single household's decision. Yet the household decisions had already been made. Sons had already been steered toward public employment and service trades rather than the apprenticeships their fathers held. The industrial base did not hollow first and then pull families toward safer harbors. Families moved first, reading the rent signal correctly, and the industrial base hollowed into the space they vacated. This sequence matters because it means that policy interventions aimed at the supply side, retraining programs, investment incentives, arrive after the private recalculation has already compounded across a generation. The host asks whether those who describe the trap are themselves its product. The answer is almost certainly yes, and the concession sharpens rather than blunts the argument. An economist's child who studies distribution rather than fabrication is not making an irrational choice. She is reading the same price signal correctly. The fact that the diagnostician is implicated does not invalidate the diagnosis. It confirms that the mechanism operates without regard for whether its subjects understand it. Understanding does not constitute escape. The trap is therefore not abolished by better rules or better maps. It is postponed only where families retain an external market that continues to reward making over distributing. Norway approached this condition because its non-oil export sectors, shipping, fish, engineered equipment, kept generating price signals from outside the domestic rent economy long enough to hold a parallel set of household expectations in place. That insulation was partial and it has narrowed. When the external price signal weakens or disappears entirely, the internal reallocation resumes, and it resumes at the level where it was always conducted. Not in ministries, not in central banks, but at the kitchen table where someone is deciding what kind of future is worth investing in.
The essayist is correct. The arithmetic that changes in the family's ledger is the beginning of the story. The host is right to ask if we are the kind of people who can see the result. The answer is yes, if we are willing to look at the ground beneath our feet. A society is a metabolic system. It can be organized to perform the complex chemistry of transforming raw materials into durable goods, or it can reroute itself to simply circulate things made elsewhere, living on a surplus of cheap energy. A rent, whether from oil or a reserve currency, is that cheap energy. It simplifies the national metabolism, the pathways of production atrophy. To see this atrophy, one need only go to Youngstown, Ohio. Stand on the site of the old sheet and tube works along the Mahoning River, where for decades the valley produced roughly a fifth of America's steel. An iron molder's granddaughter, let's call her Sophia, works there now. Her grandfather helped cast the structural members that went into bridges from Pittsburgh to Baltimore. His hands knew the heft of a wrench that could turn a 2-inch bolt. He built the country's bones. Sophia works in one of the vast logistics and fulfillment centers built on the leveled remains of that mill. Her hands hold a scanner, and her movements through the aisles are timed to the second by software. She handles goods that arrive in containers from Qingdao and Busan, packing them for delivery. Her work is not about fabrication, it is about acceleration. Consider how that transition unfolded structurally. When a reserve currency functions as the economy's dominant rent, the adjustment sequence does not begin on a factory floor. It begins in the credit market. Capital flows toward the sectors that benefit from cheap imported goods, retail, logistics, finance, and away from the sectors that require patient, incremental investment in tooling and skill. The household balance sheet adjusts first. Cheaper televisions, cheaper clothing, cheaper debt. The mill adjusts last, and permanently. Her grandfather's labor was embedded in the nation's physical skeleton. Her labor is a line item in a global supply chain, a chain whose financial architecture depends utterly on the dollar's role as the system's reserve fuel. This is what the curse looks like when it comes not from a wellhead, but from a currency. The furnace is cool. The scanners take their place. At the end of her shift, Sophia puts a box on a conveyor belt. That is the work.
The falsifiability problem runs deeper than I first stated. We cannot distinguish between institutions prevent Dutch disease and Dutch disease only appears where institutions were already weak, because we have systematically excluded the one test case that would matter. A well-governed state that discovers resource wealth after building export manufacturing at scale. Japan discovered the Kashiwazaki oil field in 1959. Commercial production began in 1962. Trivial volumes by Gulf standards, but the mechanism should still operate. Currency appreciation, labor reallocation, exactly the pressures the theory predicts. Yet Toyota, which exported its first passenger car to the United States in 1957, continued expanding. Electronics followed the same trajectory. The sector that should have been crowded out instead accelerated. The response will be that the field was too small to matter. But that concession is fatal to the theory's universality. If the mechanism operates at all scales, then even modest resource income should produce measurable sectoral distortion in a manufacturing economy. If it requires threshold effects, that only large windfalls trigger the pathology, then we are no longer describing a general economic law. We are describing a dose-response curve whose shape we have not mapped. What we lack entirely is the control experiment. Germany or South Korea discovering North Sea scale reserves in 1975. At the moment, their export sectors were most vulnerable to currency pressure. We will never have it. Every industrialized economy that found significant hydrocarbons did so either before mass manufacturing existed or after it was already entrenched enough to survive the shock. This means the motion's claim that the pattern has almost no exceptions is not a scientific statement. It is a historical observation about the sequence in which discoveries occurred. The mechanism may be real, but we have no way to know whether institutions defeat it or simply never faced the test when it would have mattered most.